Welcome, art historians. We are now moving on from classical India and now moving into classical China. And the reason that I have China follow India is because one of the major belief systems that's going to influence Chinese art is going to be Buddhism, which is going to, even though it's not really that popular in India after a time, it will become very, very popular in East Asia, particularly in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. It's going to very nicely mix in with a lot of the native religions that are there. So let's go ahead and dive in and start looking at the context of classical China. So just like India, China is going to be very isolated. So that idea of where you are is who you are is really going to play a role with China because their western border is really a great deal of desert and mountains, which, except for the north up here, kind of makes it difficult to access for a very long time. And China, being as isolated as they are, they kind of develop a culture that's their own and kind of a view of themselves that they are the center of the world. They kind of develop their own beliefs and their own ideas and didn't really have or still don't have a need for anybody else. They kind of viewed themselves as the middle kingdom and the center of the entire universe. So even when they open China up to the Silk Road, because the Silk Road gets its name from the demand for Chinese silk, they're still not going to be very needy of other things from other places, with the exception of horses. They really did need those, and that's a whole nother part of their culture. But they're really going to have this very distinct culture. But what is going to come in through trade, obviously other than just trade objects, is going to be ideas and belief systems. And those are really the things that have the biggest impact on China rather than the objects that come in. So the way that we do Chinese art and architecture is by looking through a succession of dynasties. And this is really the best way for you to organize your information when it comes to studying China. So it's a little bit like Rome. Whoever is in power at the time, whether it's the Senate or whether it's a different emperor like the Flavians versus Octavian's family, the art is going to kind of change with each dynasty. We kind of saw this in Mesopotamia as well. But remember that skill of continuity and change. Those are two really big things to think about as we go through China. What is going to continue on with each dynasty that becomes classical? So if an idea continues on, the art and architecture that represents it will continue on with it. And then how will each dynasty kind of put its own change or spin on that, depending on the belief systems that they adopt or develop. So really kind of use that as your guideline for studying. China is looking at, as we go through these different dynasties, what continues each, like this is classical. So classical means still continues today. How does that continue through these different dynasties? And then what is it that's going to change? So remember, a dynasty is kind of like a ruling family that rules for a long period of time. And if they heavily establish a particular idea, that has more chance to stick the longer that it's around. So the very first dynasty that we know of in China is going to be the Shang. And we've actually kind of already talked about them because this was the early civilization of China. So they developed along the Yellow River, very similar to what we saw in other parts of the world, that their civilizations develop on a water source because of farming. And the Shang are going to establish very early on some common things that the Chinese do and still do today. One of those is the writing system that they developed that we have found is very similar to the writing system they still have. Ancestor worship was a huge part of Shang culture and still is a major part of Chinese culture today. If you've seen Mulan, this idea of worshiping ancestors and the elderly and people who will be passing into the next world, who can intervene on behalf of the families that are still here. You've seen this in Mulan too, like when Mulan's in trouble, the ancestors are stepping in to help her because they're kind of the communicators between the spirits and the living. This is still a huge part of their culture today. And the Shang are also going to establish early on those social classes and the artistic techniques that kind of go with those social classes. So one of the big things in Shang culture was ceramic pottery, and that's the ceramics in China are going to become a very big deal. In fact, when we talk about fine china or a china cabinet, that's the term for basically porcelain and ceramics that came from China and was a very fine art form. We're also going to see jade, just like we saw it with the jade Kong and the practice of what we think was incorporating jade with the ancestor worship. So it had like this very symbolic meaning. Now, After the Shang Dynasty collapses, we're going to see the rise of another dynasty called the Zhou. All right, and we don't actually really have an art style that goes with the Zhou, because the Zhou are just going to keep kind of doing what the Shang did. And the Zhou started this idea that we've seen everywhere else of using religion as the ultimate trump card. So why do you get to rule? Because God said so. Because who's going to argue with that? They don't actually know that that's not the case. So the Zhou established something called the Mandate of Heaven in China, which was basically the gods blessed them with the right to rule, and they will know when they have lost the mandate because of things like natural disasters, like flooding or things like that, which makes it very easy for somebody to say, oh, that river flooded, you guys have lost the mandate, and turn people against that dynasty. So kind of a mistake. But another thing that the Zhou did was they decided to decentralize China, and instead of being like Persia, where there is one person at the center of everything who makes decisions through a bureaucracy, they decided to use feudalism, which the whole result of feudalism rests in its name. It causes a bunch of feuds. So what the emperor did is divided up land to lords in this area, or in the empire, and then what he would do is say, all right, I'm giving you this gift of land to live off of. Your job is to provide me with a military whenever I need it. So people who are going to fight for you, for me, whenever time comes. And those people that you're going to give land to be soldiers are going to be responsible for protecting the people on your land, all of the peasants who don't own land. And then those soldiers basically don't have to do anything because the peasants living on the land will do all the farming, all the hard work, and basically give a very nice life for you and for the knights living on your land. Well, you can only imagine people get jealous over the amount of land that other people have. It starts feuds between these different states who recognize, like, a state is a group that recognizes loyalty to one particular government. And in China, it wasn't to the emperor, it was to whoever was the lord of your state. So what this does is it causes China to break into a period of pure chaos called the period of the warring states, where that's what they were doing. They were fighting with each other, trying to overthrow the emperor. So you can imagine there's not going to be a whole lot of art or architectural development during this particular time. So I like to kind of explain what happened after the Zhou to watching Kindergarten Cop or seeing a kindergarten classroom. Because basically, if you've ever seen the movie Kindergarten Cop or a kindergarten classroom in general, I have 2 kids under the age of 6, and I don't know how those people teach elementary school. They all need basically a medal. So the whole idea is China looks like a kindergarten classroom that has gone out of control. Nobody's listening. People are fighting, throwing things at each other. Some people are crying. The hamster's on the ceiling. Some kids drinking glue. It is out of control. And you start to get philosophies that develop of, okay, whose fault is this? Number one. And number two, how do we deal with it to make sure that it never happens again? So you see 3 new classical philosophies that develop in China. So these are belief systems, and they're beliefs regarding how a government should be run, basically. So on one side, you have legalists, and legalists are all about the law. They're all about strict punishment. Like, if this is how it's going to be, it's the parents' fault for not teaching the kids. It's the kids' fault for not listening. And what we need is harsh discipline. So like a legalist would come in and start whooping these kids and be like, everybody's getting a timeout. Nobody's getting recess. Nobody's getting dessert. You know, everybody's getting a whooping. That's how it's going to be. Confucianists, on the other hand, would say, you know what, I think that in order for this to get better, we have to start by, number one, they blame the parents. They'd be like, you're not teaching your kids respect at home. Like, it's just not happening. Like, you're not teaching your kids how to be respectful. They're not respecting their elders. They're not respecting anybody. And if a person learns as a child to be respectful of their ancestors and their elders, then if they rise to the position to actually get to be a leader, then they will be respectful of their people and their people will respect them. Respect was a huge part of this. And this still exists in China today. Like, you respect your elders. If your elders say that you're going to play the violin and you're going to get straight A's, then that's what you're going to do, because it all reflects on your family. They also believe in ideas of good moral obedience, which means also you ladies, you were obedient to the males in your house, including your sons. And that education was critically important because people who are educated make better decisions. And I can explain it this way. I've got 2 kids. My oldest is almost 7. And Noah, whenever he gets angry, now he generally will just argue about it and he'll talk back. And then maybe at the end of the issue, he might throw something, all right, because he's just run out of arguments. But it takes a while. Like he tries to rationalize it out as best as his 7-year-old brain can. My daughter is 4. She doesn't have the level of education or words. Like she runs out of words quicker in an argument and therefore is much quicker to punch her brother in the nose because she ran out of words. Just she's willing to throw a punch and start a fight because she's not educated yet. So Confucianists believe that everybody should be educated. That should be huge because that leads to better decisions, less irrational decisions, less impulse. And if your government is educated, then people will be doing their jobs knowing how to actually do it. So Confucianists would say, educate your kids, and also let's teach them respect. Now, a Taoist, on the other hand, is that parent who would walk into the room and go, you know what, kids get anxious, they get crazy, and then they get tired. So eventually they're just going to go to sleep and they'll pass out. It's natural for kids to be crazy. So let's just let them naturally calm down. Taoists think that government is created by man and it's not natural, so therefore governments are bad. And they think that if people just step back and let everything work itself out, then eventually all the problems would stop. They're kind of hippies, all right? So they're like, flowers don't have rules and they're happy. That's actually a Taoist quote, all right? So they would sit back and go, you know what? Governments aren't natural. That's why we're having all these problems. Let's just sit back and let all these things kind of naturally work itself out, just like nature renews itself all the time. Okay, well, so we have these 3 new philosophies about how a government should be run and how people should act, and it's these new belief systems. And then in 221 BCE, we get, so Rome is going about this time. So just to give you an idea of where we are, a new dynasty rises up led by Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, all right, who has this incredible army behind him. He's one of the strongest warlords, and he comes in and starts breaking up the fights and unifying all of these warring states into the Qin Empire, which is where the word China actually comes from. He's considered to be the first emperor because he united all of these different states in China, because not everybody was the same in China. There's different groups, to become one empire that he ruled over it all. Now he is, if walking into this kindergarten classroom, he knows in that moment it needs legalism. He's very, very harsh. He did not want people thinking or questioning him. He actually killed a lot of Confucians, buried them alive. But he did do, I have to say, some positive things for China. Like he united them under one writing system, one money system. All axles on carts had to be the same. Like basically it was, we're all going to be one unified China together. One law system, everything. He didn't like Confucianists because they asked questions. He didn't like Taoists because they are too anti-government. And he wanted people dumb. He didn't like the idea of education unless it came to him, because he was trying to find this elixir for immortal life, and was kind of obsessed with Mercury, which surrounds his tomb actually, which is crazy. But he was trying to find ways to calm all this chaos down and protect China from invasion. So Qin Shi Huangdi is actually the emperor who establishes the Great Wall of China, which did not go all the way around China. It went north of China to protect that northern border where they didn't have natural borders from nomadic invasion. So what we have here is basically a person who put all these people to work building this wall to keep them busy and serve a purpose for China. And if you died building the wall, then you just became a part of it. Like he was incredibly brutal as a ruler. All right, I'm not sure why my sound isn't working, but I would highly recommend that you go and look at this video when you get a chance. All right, so the work of art that we're going to look at is the Terracotta Army, which has been claimed to be the most ambitious art project that anybody has ever done using just clay. And what happens is a group of well diggers actually stumbled across, while doing some digging, they found what turned out to be thousands and thousands of terracotta clay figures, all right, that were they were buried as part of a complex for Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, and his actual tomb has never been disturbed. So there could be more of these. We don't know that, but in order to protect the structural integrity of the tomb and make sure it doesn't collapse, it actually hasn't really been messed with. But this army that he had commissioned, like that basically put all of these useful hands that could have been doing anything else, he used this labor to create an army to take with him into the afterlife. And part of that may have been because he knew he had created so many enemies in this life and killed so many people that he was going to need this in the next life. Now, what's crazy about this Terracotta Army, which by the way, pieces of it do get to travel the world, like they won't release the whole thing, but they'll let some of the statues travel across the world. And actually recently one came to the United States and somebody broke off a thumb of one in one of our museums on purpose, which caused a really big problem. But these soldiers, all of them were unique. All right, there was not one of them that looks exactly the same. Depending on the clothing that they're wearing, their clothing actually tells us their rank or their job. Some of them were like kneeling as archers. Some of them are holding chariots. There's horses that were buried in there with it. I mean, this was forced labor. And fortunately, he didn't have an entire, human army buried with him. He just had instead this terracotta army. But everything about this, down to the hair that was put into it, the shape of their hands, their faces, and all of them are posed and ready for battle. Like they are ready to go, ready to fight at any given moment. And the weapons, this is kind of crazy, they have found that they were holding were actually plated in chrome, which is something that Germany couldn't even do with chrome until the 1930s. It's absolutely insane what they were able to do with this. So this tomb that they have found is the largest burial complex in the world. So you can imagine, like, we're thinking of the pyramids. No, this is for one person in terms of everything that he had buried in there with them. The faces, the mustaches, the expressions on their face, the armor that they're wearing, nothing is identical. They're all unique. And there's horses in there with them, chariots, weaponry, everything that he would possibly need, because this strict legalist ruler who used this army is now going to use it, to protect him in the afterlife. So after the Qin collapse, which you can imagine that after Qin Shi Huangdi, there really isn't a whole lot to go on because people were kind of sick of such a harsh ruler. We see the rise of what's called the Han Dynasty, who gives China kind of what is its first golden age. And one of the reasons that it was so easy for the Han to step in is you can kind of see the difference in the picture here. So if I go back a little bit, I mean, you can see everything here about this guy. It looks strict and stern, and he's a soldier and he's a warrior. And then, so we go back the other way. Here you have the Han. Their faces are much more relaxed. They're wearing their robes, they're wearing hats of scholars, like they're much more educated. And that's because they adopt the belief systems of Confucianism and Taoism, because you could be a Confucianist and a Taoist because Confucianist wasn't a religion. Taoism is more about worship of nature spirits and gods and being in touch with nature. Taoists are all about acupuncture and natural medicine and feng shui and chiropractic care. Like they're all about combining the natural world with the human world. So you could be a Confucianist by day and study during the day and then go home and have, a Taoist ritual at night. So they embraced both of these ideas, and their civil service system that they created is if you're going to work for the government, you have to be educated. And this bureaucracy that they had, every single person had to pass an exam to show that they could do that job. Now, the Han Dynasty, because they do adopt Confucianism, the women took a big hit in status because Confucianism was all about women being subservient to husbands and showing respect to the men in their life. But the Han Dynasty brought such a great time period of peace, and they moved so many people outside of the borders to be able to farm and provide food for the rest of the people, that Han China started to become a lot more commercialized, where they were making stuff to sell, not just to survive. And one of those major items is going to be the production of silk, which was a state-run business. Originally, it used to be women who knew how to make silk, but now the men were going to be trained in the different steps so that more of it could be produced and sell along the Silk Road. Now, under the time of the Han, all right, we're going to start to see the arrival of Buddhism into China. Now, it's not going to take hold on a great scale yet, but the idea is that, Buddhism, because it was all about internal improvement and reflection, that kind of worked with Taoism and this idea of respect and nature. Now, Confucianism and Buddhism are going to butt heads a little bit because Confucianism is all about what's good for the state and for us, and Buddhism is all about what's good for me. And how I can improve and how I can reach enlightenment. So those two ideas clashed a little bit, but Confucianism and Taoism could go together hand in hand very well. All right. So Taoism, or the Tao or Tao, means the way. So it's kind of like the way to finding balance. This is where you get yin and yang and the ways that you need to find balance through the respecting of nature and spirits. They're very big into the mountains, which of course we've seen that before in India and Greece. And they believe in just this cosmic energy that kind of flows through everything. And to them, the emptiness is just as important as the space. All right. So it kind of reminds me of an artist named, oh my gosh, my brain just went completely blank. She was just at the art museum and she does, I'll find the name. This is driving me crazy, but she did works of art where she would fill things like sheds and fill them with like plaster molds or like wax or resin, and then take the shell of the building away, and you would just see like the basic sculpture was the negative space, and it was really kind of cute, like cool. The Taoists are kind of like that. Like in yin and yang, the emptiness is just as important as the space, and they're all about, we say, Eastern style medicine, of everything being very natural. They like things that are not man-made or synthetic. Like they like to use natural treatments, like medicine that is, from the earth, or, acupuncture, like I said, or chiropractic. Confucianism could go with this, like I said, because it's more of a philosophy about how people should act and what they should do, and not really a religion. So Taoism provided kind of that spirituality for people who needed more than just Confucianism. All right. So the Han, in establishing this golden age, we're really going to start to see the rise of classical China. Confucianism continues today. So does Taoism. Buddhism is still a big part, even though it really wasn't at this point that much. And it really, like, being such a peaceful time in China allows for a time of great artistic development. So we start to see poetry and paintings, and we see silk production. So of course, naturally, you're going to start to see paintings on silk, which is not uncommon. And silk was a status for the upper class because we're now in a commercialized society, and money means nothing if you can't show it off. So having a painting done on silk, that was a huge status symbol. Okay, so this is, hang on just one second. I'm going to put this. Okay, so hopefully the sound works. All right, but I'm going to preface this next piece of art by showing you this video. Okay, so just as kind of a preview into what we're about to talk about. So one of the pieces for the 250 is the funeral banner of Lady Di, which was found very well preserved within her burial chamber. Now we know that she had to have been of aristocratic status for a woman in a Han Dynasty that really worships or followed Confucianism. That she actually had this elaborate burial, so she was probably married to somebody who was pretty high up in the government. So what we found with her, right, was this funeral banner, which is made of silk, and which would have been very big during the Han Dynasty because that's what was huge during that time. That's why the Silk Road got its name. So this is actually a scroll painting that had a very specific function in terms of burial. And it kind of looks like a robe, like a silk robe that somebody wealthy would have worn. So something kind of like with Egypt, like recognizing their faces on their tomb, something that she would recognize. So what they think this was for was to, number one, serve as an identifier for her because she actually does show up in this multiple times. It's kind of a narrative, like we saw in the column of Trajan. And they call this a flyaway garment because it could be used, because it kind of looks like wings a little bit, to help her soul fly to the afterlife. But it also could have been believed to bring her back, her soul back one more time before it went to the afterlife because they didn't want her to go. So it actually was laid on the top of the coffin so that the soul would come back to this and then leave the living alone. So it's kind of like if you're confused and don't get upset and like upset the living, come back to this instead. And of course, it being silk would have attracted her of wealthy status. She would have come back to this. So this funeral banner combines a couple different ideas during this time, the belief systems of Taoism and also Confucianism, because everything here is in balance, right? So there's always two sides, like two snakes intertwined, two leopards, two everything that's put on here. So we'll talk about those things in a second. So like sun and moon, life and death. So like you've got the afterlife at the top, the underworld at the bottom, and then in the middle is her life. All right, so that's kind of a point of this. And the fact that there's no negative space on this, the color fills in the negative space because that red color is attracting. It's just as important as the images themselves. We think this may be one of the earliest known Chinese portraits because the person that they see on here is holding a cane, is overweight, is elderly, and that is what Lady Di was. She was very wealthy. She lived a lavish lifestyle. She probably died of heart disease and high cholesterol based on her diet at this time. Now in the middle section here, right, so you've got the upper part that looks like, the upper tier is the, heavenly realm. The bottom is the underworld. And then you've got, which you actually see like a Kong down there at the bottom, if you can see that. In the middle is that Confucian idea of her descendants having a funeral feast to her, or feasting to her, and then at the same time worshiping her body and worshiping and doing the funeral services for her. So it's that idea of Confucian respect for your ancestors and elders combined with this at the time. So this funeral banner, like I said, is divided into three sides, and it's very much a narrative because, like I said, Lady Di does show up in it several times. This could have been directing her as far as which direction to go or what to do. It could have been trying to keep her here to remind her that the underworld is scary, so stay here in this life with people who know you. It could be to hold her soul because it reflects who she was in life. She can recognize herself and it's a wealthy item. There's all different kinds of theories, but it goes heaven, earth, and the underworld into three parts, and everything is in balance. So the dragons in the underworld, there's always that connection, like that this world is connected to the last world and the underworld. So like the dragons of the underworld are coming up into her earthly realm, all right? And so like these two dragons connected together are life and death and yin and yang, and they're actually coming through a bee, which is part of the Jade Kong. So on Earth, all right, this is the life that she had. Then you see her funeral feast at the top, and then she's descending up into heaven and saying goodbye. So it really reinforces Confucianism and Taoism, and it's very, very balanced on purpose. So again, we're not, like you can see here she is right here. She's wearing a cane, she's wearing a silk robe. They're kneeling before her out of respect. You have the two dragons on each side. So all of this is about balance and this world and the next world and the interconnection. Dragons are very nature based. They're bringing water, right? So kind of to this, which is life quenching or extinguishing like a fire. And then this may have been used one last time to try to revive her before she goes into the afterlife. And I just thought this was interesting, that you can see like a little bit closer detail. O soul, come back, climb not to the heaven above. For tigers and leopards guard the 9 gates, with jaws ever ready to rend up mortal man. And one man with 9 heads that can pull up 9,000 trees, and the slant-eyed jackal wolves pad to and fro. So it's kind of like a warning. O soul, come back, lest you fall into this danger. So like basically, saying, stay here with us. We're not ready for you to go. There's all these dangers in the next world. So eventually the Han are going to collapse. And there are several reasons for that, mostly internal issues. Eventually you're going to have the plague comes through along the Silk Road. And when the plague comes along the Silk Road, it actually wipes out a great deal of people and the army. But the army has to keep being paid and being fed to protect the exterior wall. So that means taxes are going to be raised on the peasants. The peasants don't have enough money to pay their taxes and to feed themselves. So you start to see internal rebellions, and eventually the Han are going to be invaded by nomadic groups and also internal rebellions. But the Han was such an incredible dynasty, it's going to take 350 years for another dynasty to come along that can actually unify China like the Han did. And to this day, the greatest ethnic group in China is Han China. Like they're a very distinct group. So for a while, we're going to have just chaos in China. It's going to be a very terrible time. And during that time, and this is an important part of the story, Buddhism is going to be kind of what holds China together. Kind of like Christianity after the Roman Empire collapsed. It's going to be what gives people strength. The Buddhist monasteries, which were those, religious communities, could give people a chance to go there for food or for peace or for solace. So Buddhism after the Han really comes into China, especially along the Silk Road, and kind of becomes the hope that China needs during this time. So we have very temporarily one small dynasty called the Sui Dynasty, who were legalists. They were very harsh. They built the Grand Canal that still runs through China, which does unify North and South China, allowing food to come from South to Northern China. But they were so strict, they quickly get overthrown. And we get this new dynasty called the Tang Dynasty. And the Tang are incredibly militaristic. They're not Han Chinese. They're actually a different group. They're kind of what I consider the Sparta of China. Like they are much more concerned with expanding out and fighting than they are with the education side. Now they do continue Confucianism because they like the way it works. They do continue Taoism, but they are huge promoters of Buddhism. And that's because the Tang were smart enough to realize that Buddhism has been around and has been the saving grace of people for this long, that if we try to take it away, they are going to rebel against us. So what the Tang would do is actually give tax exemptions to the Buddhist monasteries and be like, okay, if you support our rule and make us look good, you guys don't have to pay taxes on all the offerings and everything that people give to you. You don't have to pay taxes on your land. So basically, the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist monasteries became incredibly powerful in their own right, enough so that later on the Tang are going to go, you know what, this is a bit too much. So we call the Tang Dynasty post-classical China because the Qin and the Han are when we see those classical ideas really develop of Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, and Buddhism starts to come in and take hold. But post-classical China is when the decision is made of, okay, what do we continue and what do we not? And the Tang are going to make the decision to continue not only Confucianism and Taoism, but Buddhism as well. And we're going to stop there. And in our next lecture, we're going to look at the Longmen Caves created by the Tang, which represent their true devotion to this belief system of Buddhism.